And now, Mr. Tabler of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission on the Assad regime's brutal year-long crackdown on Syria's pro-democracy protesters. Throughout the years as a journalist and analyst based in Damascus, I followed Tom Lantos's often critical words on the Assad regime's policies with great interest. And I'm pleased to see that the Commission continues his good work to this day at a key time in the Syrian uprising. I've been asked today to provide testimony based on my recent trip to Antakya, southern Turkey, and northern Lebanon last month, where I met with Syrian refugees and oppositionists based in both countries. With the help of the Turkish authorities, who have done a solid job of taking care of Syrians fleeing to their country, I was able to enter the refugee camp at Yaylada, one of the 7 Syrian camps near the Turkish-Syrian frontier in Turkey's Hatay province. The Yaylada camp, which once was a tobacco factory, hosts around 2,000 residents in makeshift tents, each warmed with an electric heater provided by the Turkish Red Crescent. The residents seemed well taken care of, and the Turkish control over concerning entry and exit to the camps was complete. The residents I interviewed hailed from communities along the Syrian coast, the ancestral homeland of the Alawites, the minority that dominates the Syrian regime, or conservative Idlib province. Like most, if not all, Syrian refugees in Turkey, they were Sunni. All those I interviewed were a mix of ethnic Arabs and Turkomans. All shared with me harrowing stories of their plight against regime forces in Syria, including in many cases having to flee in the wake of attacks by Shabiha, armed gangs primarily of Alawites, who terrorized Sunni villagers throughout the Syrian coast and beyond. Others from Idlib, all of whom had already spent up to a decade of their lives imprisoned under the Assad regime, following the 1982 crackdown, spoke of the regime's brutal raid into their community of Jisr Shughur and their families' hurried exit across the border to Turkey for safety. None imagined returning to Syria unless the Assad regime collapses, and no one I met believed that would happen sooner or later without force. The real story of what's going on with Syrian refugees in Hatay province happens outside the camps, however. Hatay is officially disputed territory between Turkey and Syria, and people there are a mix of Sunnis, Alawites, and Turkmen. While the area was ceded to Turkey in 1939, large families still straddle the border. Thousands of refugees who have elected to leave the camps did not return to Syria. They stayed in Hatay with family. More fortunate Syrians who fled the fighting simply rent apartments in and around Antakya. To their credit, Turkey has turned a benevolent blind eye to Syrians whose visas probably expired months ago. Like those refugees in the camps, Syrians in Hatay just try to get through the day as best they can, but there are others who are acting on the notion that Assad will not go without force. Members of the Free Syrian Army, or an organization formed last June by military deserters, an organization formed last June by Colonel Riyad al-Assad, a military deserter who resides in what was referred to as the soldiers' camp at Ayadin, have watched the horror going on across the border in Syria for months. Like civilian refugees residing in Hatay, they are outraged at the Assad regime's brutal suppression of the Syrian uprising. They communicate with fellow deserters via phones, iPhones, and similar smartphones using the Turkish cell phone network and via voice-over IP program Skype. For those in Turkey, there is little more they can do other than monitor movements and activities of regime forces in Syria and give advice on what residents of villages or cities where they should flee. Like civilian refugees I met in Hatay, FSA members wondered why the international community had not done more to protect Syrians from what they consider one of the most brutal regimes in the world with the worst human rights record. I tried to respond with what we hear in the news about the strength of Syria's air defenses, or the fear of setting off civil war or aiding al-Qaeda. They scoffed at my answers. Doesn't the United States have the strongest military in the world, one asked. Don't you pay taxes for a reason, another said. Does it matter if people die in an uprising or a civil war, another asked. And last but not least, just because some of us are pious Muslims and have beards doesn't make us al-Qaeda. You lived in Syria and you know that. That doesn't mean that there are not some things to worry about, especially in poor and conservative Idlib province. There is some evidence of Islamist groups operating there that share U.S. short-term interests of bringing down the Assad regime, but not our long-term interest in helping foster a secular post-Assad Syria. But they do not, and I have to emphasize, do not make up anything close to the majority of the Syrian opposition that I've met. Given the diversity of sects in Syria and the divisions in the Sunni community as well, it is far from clear to me how much traction Islamic extremist groups really have throughout the country. The Assad regime is keen to keep Syrians from fleeing the fighting, as refugee flows would trigger an external intervention by Turkey. Today, Turkey estimates about 17,000 refugees are within its borders from Syria. There are surely far more that we don't know about. The day we left Antakya, we began to receive news that the Assad regime was laying mines on the foot trails leading into Hatay, an admonition that the regime was preparing to move its onslaught north into Hama and Idlib governorate from the central city of Homs. To find out what's going on in Homs, one need only visit northern Lebanon, where the thousands of Syrian refugees have moved out of the pocket of Wadi Khalid, where they were last year, into the Sunni hinterland north and east of the Lebanese coastal town of Tripoli and into the Bekaa Valley.
Could you wrap up your testimony, Mr. Tabler?
Sure. When folks in Washington ask my overall impression of my visit to southern Turkey and northern Lebanon, I often say it felt akin to the storyline of the 1990s film Twister. The year-long uprising in Syria is like a tornado with two forces swirling around each other. A tyrannical minority-dominated regime with a 42-year proven history of being unable to reform on one side, and an opposition chiseled out of a country that boasts one of, if not the youngest populations in the Middle East outside the Palestinian territories. These two forces can't mix. You can feel the tension on Syria's borders as this political tempest continues to churn, killing thousands and displacing many more. I see no sign that this conflict will settle down anytime soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now Professor Radwan Ziadeh, Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. Professor.
Mr. Chairman McGovern and other distinguished members of the Commission, thank you very much for holding these very important hearings at the time when the human rights situation in Syria has become more dire than ever, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to testify. Let me start actually with a personal story, and very pleased actually to have the invitation of the leadership of Congressman Keith Ellison. I did first time with the Congressman Ellison in 2007 when I came here to the tour by the ESNA group. And when I returned to Syria, I received a postcard from Mr. Congressman Ellison. I've been interrogated for 3 days in the headquarters of the Syrian intelligence in Damascus by receiving a postcard from Congressman. And I think it's important to mention this case because the violations of the human rights in Syria actually started, and it's been widespread and systematic years before actually the uprising started. What we have today actually, it's that first time actually the international community and the world watching what's going on in Syria, being in the largest scale, systematic and widespread killing. I will not repeat actually what Marina and Susan mentioned about the human rights abuses, but I'm here just actually to give insights. Some myself as a Syrian were actually who shocked about the everyday news about what's going on in my country. Yesterday actually I did receive a list of 55 physicians and doctors who's been actually killed since last year. 12 of them actually been tortured until they are died. One of them actually who was colleague of mine from Homs, his name Jamal Fatwa, he's been detained on August 14 and he's delivered to his family on after 2 weeks later been died. And one of the case who actually get less attention from the media, who was actually Dr. Abdulrazak Jabiro, who's actually the head of the Red Cross in Idlib. He's been actually detained and tortured. And this is a case of actually none of those who engaged even that in peaceful protest, none of those actually who engaged in armed opposition, rather than actually their charge that been helping the injured and wounded people. And this is why the Assad regime refused to give any assistance or even that to open hospitals or medical centers for any of the wounded people or protesters. let me emphasize here on two issues which are actually important. We are very thankful, of course, for the Ambassador Ford's words about the importance of the accountability for Syria. Syria has witnessed actually one of the most horrific human rights abuses in the 80s, where actually more than 25,000 has been killed. And after 30 years, we're still talking about the estimate number. Nobody knows exactly about the exact number who have been killed in the 80s. And this is why I give you the sense that this regime can continue the killings without any sense or any feelings of the accountability, because they have strong feeling of the immunity. And it's important for the United States and all others in the country who push actually for the International Criminal Court to open investigation about the ongoing crimes against humanity carried out in Syria. The UN Human Rights Council have 4 sessions on Syria, and every time have strong resolution. The last one described the crisis in Syria as a man-made humanitarian crisis, and ask actually for the International Criminal Court to open investigation in Syria. But because the position of Russia and China, still actually the Security Council was unable to refer the crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court. This is why it's important for the United States and other countries to look for ways how to make these crimes against humanity accountable. And the United States should play also a leading role in helping Syrians in their noble struggle toward freedom and democracy. This is why the US should facilitate and support the deployment of humanitarian agencies to Syria to make aid available to the people with support of the UN. With the international community to isolate Assad through establishing the International Coalition of Friends of Syria, we'll have the second meeting in Istanbul next Sunday. But let me emphasize this conference should be not concentrate about the humanitarian assistance, because this has been actually an issue. The Syrian revolution, when it started for dignity, human rights, and democracy, not for getting money from the international community or getting money from the world. This is why it's important actually for the United States and other international community help to establishing humanitarian safe haven or safe areas to protect the civilians and facilitate emergency aid. Without getting such area, the Assad regime will not accept, will not allow for any humanitarian or food assistance to get in the areas who are in need. What the United Nations mentioned, that's more than 320,000 has been displaced within Syria. This is why they ask for actually open investigations about the area of the population of Bab Amr, where actually all the population who are displaced went to Damascus or to the Damascus suburbs. It's important for the United States now to recognize that repeating the peaceful solutions or such words has far away from the ground on Syria. The ground in Syria has become a humanitarian disaster, and the United States should look for ways to put actions and to implement actions to stop the killings who are actually encouraged by the Assad regime every day. Thank you very much.